Hey, welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. Today we have the brand new guild map, Mines number 2, or Mines the second, and I'm going over a little bit of map theory here. This is something that we do in our guild, but I've never actually done publicly. Figured it's about time I kind of included you in my thought process on how I make my attack and defense comps. Now, obviously, if when you're in a certain tier ranking of guilds, say top 10, top 15, there are obviously certain meta characters and things you're going to experience over and over repetitively for those macros, but that being said, we, having new map, haven't decided exactly what those are. More is released and how that might upturn things, how the map overall has changed, some characters' mobility movements and their range, and how the AI acts. And overall, because it's a new map, everything is kind of up in the air, even though you might have a gut feeling how it's going to shake out. So this is an opportunity to kind of poke some holes in some things, theory craft, and really stress test. So a couple things I want to talk about immediately is differences from this map to the prior map. So long story short, this map is actually very, very long. Most of the other maps are much smaller than this, where within one turn or two turns, you're already within striking range of the enemy, and that often affects how you will use your turn 1 or turn 2 to buff, to move in a certain direction, what abilities you're going to use, how many you're going to get off, etc. So the fact that this is a very large, long map changes things significantly from the past 2 or 3 maps that we've had. That's immediately apparent, and that can also be seen in the potential turn 1 buffing. So most of these maps, they've actually had staggered distances between a lot of these slots, where slot 1 and 2 might have been 4 spaces, the other one might have been 3 spaces. This one, it's actually perfectly equal in terms of starting spots. So it is technically reversed, where your slots 1, 2, and 3 will be reversed from their slots 1, 2, and 3. So your slot 1 will be diagonal to their slot 1, but they are completely equal and on a linear plane across the map in the same tiles. So do with that what you will. The turn 1 buffing, though, what makes this really interesting is previously on these smaller maps, you may not have always gotten your team buffs off because someone might have moved in a range where you could potentially strike quicker, or if there was a strong enough hate aggro on your side, you would do that instead. But because these are all 3 slots away from each other, I do think there's a ton of opportunity to use teammate buffs that we haven't been able to in the past, where you're at virtually no risk for being pulled away from those teammate buffs because the team is still so far away. So both of these slots, 1 and 3, are 3 slots away from the middle. So hypothetically, both of them could move in on a teammate that's slower in the middle and kind of congregate here to start off the team fight. And then if not, there's also a bunch of flank routes, which we'll get to in a second as well. But this turn 1 is really important. I think it's one of the most frustrating things about the prior maps, was that all you needed to do is have some difference in agility based upon a vision card or a keen blade strat, something of that nature, and you can entirely throw off what the enemy AI was planning for. So that's turn 1 in a nutshell. I think there's a lot of opportunity here to really take advantage of that and make for some comps that previously weren't that viable, and get some ramp up time for what to expect that you previously couldn't. The second most important thing is what I call the laning. And the laning of a map is typically driven by where the aggro source is. Now, in the previous maps, we typically have 1 lane right down the middle. About 2 maps ago, we had 2 lanes technically. I can't remember the name of the map, unfortunately, but either way, it's supremely important, because how you lane and how you coagulate determines where the team fight actually occurs. And where the team fight occurs is where you need to really be prepared to do things you want to do, and how you get there, and who gets there first, and what kind of resistances you have to meet the initial attacks, things of that nature. So because this map is much longer, the aggro laning isn't as important, because no matter what, even if, and I use yellow typically to indicate a tank, so even if you typically had, like say tanks on either sides of the aggro, as these people move forward here, they're typically going to still coagulate kind of in the same area in the middle here. And yes, you might get some, differences on where they end up standing on which one of these squares, but it's still most likely going to end up right here in the middle. And we'll get to more of the team fight and how that will work itself out in a second, but the laning to me is not as big of an issue as it used to be, where I don't think the initial starting point of the tank is going to determine a whole lot, unless, and we'll see in a second here, you do something a little crafty with your slot 3. So on the topic of aggro and laning, I don't think it's going to be as big of an issue as it used to be. So slot 3 in particular needs some love, and there's some really important mechanic here in slot 3 that absolutely has to be addressed, because it's going to drastically affect the team fights. So slot 3 here has a very hard barrier where you go from a height of 1 to a height of 3. So unless a character has a jump of 2, they're going to, every single time, no matter what, move 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 3 to their teammate. It's going to be one of those 2 moves all the time if they only have a jump of 1. This is where things get crafty. If you hypothetically had your Mont or your Dwayne here and enabled the passive of a jump of 2, you could have your tank very easily go right over this obstacle here and move to the path quicker than an enemy slot 3 might be, where they have to typically go the long route still. I think there's going to be some shenanigans there with putting your tank there and essentially getting to this part of the team before your enemy does. If I were to explain the long story short of that, if you were to hypothetically say, okay, we're going to move everyone 3 spaces, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, do my tank the same. Well, immediately what you can see here is that all 3 of your team have moved identically in pace, and the other team has not. Technically, someone is still a space behind, and more importantly than that, as we were talking about the aggro a second here, you know, no matter where the aggro is on the other team, this person is going to have to kite toward your aggro, right? So as the team fight continues to converge, you could, you know, we're going to hypothetically say that I have a middle tank here. As it starts to converge, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, you're going to notice that this slot 3 person who had less mobility than yours is going to start lagging behind, and your team is going to effectively group up here quicker than theirs is going to. So you might have a 3v2 matchup faster than anticipated. So I think that's a really interesting strat to abuse with one of your tanks, because both the meta tanks, Dwayne and King Mont, do have potential to have a jump of 2. Regardless if it's a tank or not, this is something to consider, that no matter who you put here, if it's a regular DPS, if it's a healer, they're going to have to either A, find a way to get over that hurdle, or B, you're just going to have to live with the fact that they're going to kite that way first. So the team fight on this map is going to be fairly consistent in my opinion, where it's effectively going to essentially be this laning area of the map. And the reason I say that is because these 4 black boxes in the middle are completely blocked off. You cannot jump over them. You cannot walk over them. They are inanimate objects. And the same can be said for this 2 towers here, and I have them in black. So long story short, the way your team is effectively going to move is going to, you know, this person, unless they have a jump of 2 or more, they're going to move this way. They're not going to do the flank route, which I'll get to in a second. So as that person moves this way, your tank moves this way, slot 3 is going to be in the middle. Effectively, and the same thing we said with the slot 1 over here, they're going to kite this way. So because everyone's going to kind of go this way, you can see already that the team fight is going to be kind of a slant between the 2 towers here. The reason why this is really interesting is, though, although it does create some opportunities for AoE, I don't think there's going to be as much AoE, because you do have some obstacles in your way where your team's not going to be able to necessarily group together as much. Some of them might be segregated and separated by that. The other thing that I think is super interesting is that if someone is here on a height of 1 and they have an enemy on a height of 3, unless they have an attack that has a height of 2, they will not be able to attack them. So there are some height shenanigans to play with for this row right here. That's the 1 height, and the middle area, which has the height of 3. The other thing I think is kind of interesting, throws an X factor into things, is the fact that right here in the middle, there are little boxes here that are heights of 2. So if you're talking about teammate buffs or in the middle of the map, or if you're talking about certain heights from an arithmetician, like Helena, if you have her on height 3 enabled, or, you know, height 2 enabled, you technically could throw some X factors into things by the way that these heights go from 3 to 2 rather quickly. But overall, it is still rather large AoE space, and so you still have to have some AoE resist to be ready to guard against it. One of the last things here that I think is super interesting is the flank potential on this map. We do have a lot of X upgraded characters, and someone like Zazan or Venera, who do have very large amounts of jump. And because of that, and in addition to their speed, they very often will, and lack of teammate buffs, like the list goes on, they very often will move in an absolute straight line toward the enemy. Because of that, if you were to have Zazan, say here in slot 3, effectively, because of his jump and his move, he's going to move forward. And, you know, depending on where the enemy hate is, he might move just slightly differently. So if you have an enemy tank across from him, yes, he's going to go in a straight line right at him across the map. If you have a tank that's polar opposite him, I do still think that he's going to move more in a straight line than move in a diagonal line per se, because that hate is so far away. But that does still remain to be seen out on top of a little bit of a testing. But on the topic of flank rounds, if you do, we'll say hypothetically have a tank in slot 2 or slot 3 as an enemy, Dwayne will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then he'll get to them right here. And the reason why I think this is really super interesting as a flank round, I've kind of exposed this in the past couple guild battles, where if, let's say you have a tank that's here, and I'll play out this scenario for you. Let's say you have an enemy tank right here, and you have your Zazan. You know Zazan is faster and more mobile than almost any tank in the game. He's going to move 1, 2, 3, 4. This tank's going to move 1, 2, 3. Next turn's going to occur, and you know, let's say your tank's in the middle here. Zazon's going to 1, 2, 3, 4. Your tank's going to 1, 2, 3. And you're going to effectively create a team fight here between Zazan and the tank that the tank is most likely not going to break away from for a turn or two. And I say that because your tank will be moving up. This will be moving in this direction. Kind of just playing this out here. 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Where effectively you will have taken their tank out of moving where he wants to for a turn or two, effectively leaving your team fight in the middle with your tank and their DPS. So there are some potential flank rounds to exploit, and even if they're not a tank, if that's a regular old DPS, you hypothetically could still draw the aggro of that DPS super early, so that if you do have a tank, let's say way over here, and the team fight is happening on this side of the map, you're effectively creating a giant 1v1 on that bottom half, because you have a character who can essentially get into their aggro range really, really quickly. Going off some of what we said already, because I mentioned the amount of turn 1 buffs, the range of the map, the amount of turns that it takes to get one side or the other, I have to do some testing, but I do think Missile might be viable. If it's not viable, it'll be purely because of power creep, where there isn't enough in the way of barrier break or burst damage. But hypothetically, you could easily have 3 gunners and have them all go to the middle to do their whole buff circle. And if you were to count the amount of turns it would take for someone to go from the other side of the map, you know, we'll go with this slot 2 here because they have the easiest path. It's 1, 2, 3 is turn 1, 1, 2, 3, turn 2, 1, 2, 3, turn 3, 1, 2, 3, turn 4. And this is probably like barrage-worthy range at this point. So they've effectively taken 4 turns to actually move across the map. So I do think there are some opportunities where you could have a very strong turtle comp here, the old gunner map, or the old gunners from the temple map, if you all recall, from, I don't know, 8-9 months ago. And I don't know if they're strong enough, to be honest, because many of the missile users have not gone X upgrades yet, so they just flat out might not have the power to kill them. And the other big thing to watch out for that is brand new to the AI, one of the reasons why I think it's interesting to look at this map fresh every single time, is Black Rosalena. One of her big flaws initially was her healing AI is essentially kind of like kill from the other sub-white mage jobs, where if there's an enemy in range, they will go offensively. If there's an enemy not in range, they will heal. And that's not a healer, that's just someone who's a DPS that can heal. The reason why that's important is because if you have your tanks and teammates moving across the map, let's say this is Black Rosalena right here, and let's say you do have a gunner comp and they do pew pew pew, you know, for a hit or two, Black Rosalena, because she's out of range of the gunners, will heal up her own team, which is kind of brand new and from an AI standpoint that we haven't seen given the last couple guild maps. So to the degree of whether or not they're viable, I actually don't know yet. My gut says probably not. I just don't think they have enough X upgrades and stats and like healing power down, things of that nature, but it certainly is something to tinker with and I think could catch some people off guard. The last thing to talk about is technically the laning. There are hypothetically 2 lanes here, and I say that because since this is a, you know, non-traversable area in the middle, hypothetically you do have 2 lanes here where there's either side of the box. The reason why I say hypothetically is because unlike the map 2 cycles ago where the 2 lanes were split rather far apart, these are rather close. And so even if you have a small little team fight happening here, and you have, let's say, like an Elena right here, right here, right here, right here, even King Mon, I'm fairly certain that they're still within range to get hit by things. So the laning isn't as drastic as the prior map, where effectively if you went to one side, you were kind of screwed. You couldn't get back around to the other side very easily. This one's not the case, though. You can, and you quite easily do it by two or three slots here. So that's it, everybody. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this was informative. I plan to do some more once I do some more tinkering of my own, once I see some things in action and learn a little bit more about what my guild and the other guilds are doing. So good luck.